Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Odyssey Recaps Below the Surface Edition. Just a reminder that if you'd like a shorter, shallower, and slightly sassier recap, head on over to my Just the Tea series. But for now, let's dive in. Today we are recapping Book 10, titled by Emily Wilson as The Winds and the Witch. We last left off with Odysseus and his men narrowly escaping from the island of the Cyclopes. Now we open with them coming upon another magical island, this one surrounded by sheer cliffs and an impregnable wall of solid bronze, ruled by a king named Aeolus, who lives there with his wife and 12 children, who, pretty grossly, he has married to each other. They live an idyllic life and spend their days feasting and their nights in blissful, incestuous peace with each other. Odysseus and his men are welcomed to the island, and they stay there for a month, telling the king all about their battles at Troy and news of the other heroes and kings Odysseus fought with. After a month, the king sends them on their way with a gift, a magical bag of winds. The king has been given control over the winds by Zeus, and he puts the wind Zephyr, a very gentle wind, in a bag to help blow Odysseus and his men home. The bag works perfectly, and Odysseus and his men are gently blown all the way home to Ithaca in only 10 days. On the 10th day, they can actually see Ithaca and are even close enough to see men tending bonfires on the shore. Sadly, they aren't destined to make it to shore. Odysseus hasn't slept since they left Aeolus, and choosing to steer the ship himself in fear of something going wrong, so he just has not slept. With Ithaca in sight, Odysseus thinks that surely nothing can go wrong now, and so he lies down for some very much needed sleep, leaving his men to steer the ship into harbor themselves. Unfortunately, once he's asleep, his men begin to grumble to each other, unhappy with the division of spoils from all their adventures. They talk about all the treasures that Odysseus has amassed for himself, and say, "We share the journey with him, yet we come back home with empty hands." They think the bag of winds must hold even more treasure, and decide to open it and take some for themselves. But when they open the bag, all the winds come rushing out in a giant gust, and the fleet is hurled all the way back to Aeolus. Odysseus is horrified when he awakens and briefly contemplates throwing himself into the ocean and just ending his agony. But he gathers himself and climbs the steep cliffs to ask the king for a second bag of wind. Unfortunately, the king is furious and says he is not going to help someone so clearly cursed by the gods. He calls Odysseus a nasty creature and throws him out of the castle to find his own way home. Odysseus and his men set off once again, rowing laboriously and moving with agonizing slowness until they reach the next island, Laestrygonia. There they find a perfectly formed harbor surrounded by sheer high cliffs with calm water inside. The fleet all cram in to moor themselves, all except Odysseus' ship, which he moors on some rocks outside of the harbor. A scouting party heads off to find out what sort of people live on this island, and they're horrified to discover that the island is home to a race of bloodthirsty giants, the Laestrygonians, who, like the Cyclopes, want to eat them. The scouting party is eaten by the giants, except for two, who try to run back to the ship. But the Laestrygonians are faster, and they surround the harbor, hurling giant boulders to smash up the ships and spearing the men from the water like fish so that they can eat them. Odysseus' ship, which was moored outside of the harbor, is the only one to escape, with the horrible screams and cries of the crew of the other ship ringing in their ears as they sail off. They sail on and reach an island called Aea, home of the beautiful, dreadful goddess Circe. Circe is the daughter of Helios, the sun god, and of the nymph Perse, who was a child of the titan Oceanus. Odysseus and his remaining men make landfall and spend a few days recovering and grieving their lost companions. Then Odysseus goes out to explore the island. He spots smoke from a hearth fire, but decides to return to the ship first, killing a giant stag along his way and bringing it back to his men to feast on. The next morning, he gathers his men and tells them about the smoke he saw. The men are terrified and don't want to investigate, fearing another deadly encounter. But despite their fears, Odysseus divides them into two teams and sends the first to investigate, led by Eurylochus. The first team sets out, and before long they find a house built of shining stone, surrounded by wolves and lions, who've been tamed by Circe's drugs. The wild animals act like dogs, excited to see their master, and greet the terrified men. They can hear a voice coming from the inside the house, a woman's voice, singing as she weaves at a great loom. They're unsure if the voice is human or goddess, but they decide to call her out. Circe comes to the door and invites them inside. All the men enter except for Eurylochus, who stays outside, worried that it's a trap. Circe offers the men a potion made with barley, cheese, honey, and wine, and secretly laced with drugs. The men drink it and forget their homes. Then she strikes them with her magic wand and turns them all into pigs. The poem specifies that only their bodies were transformed and their minds remain the same, adding another layer of horror to the transformation. Cersei pins them in a pigsty and throws them some food. Eurylochus sees all this and runs back to the ship to tell Odysseus what has happened. He struggles to speak, filled with horror at what he's witnessed. As soon as he's able to tell them what happened, Odysseus begins to strap on his armor, ordering Eurylochus to take him back to the witch. He is going to get those men back. Eurylochus flat out refuses and begs him not to go. He says they must leave immediately and that the search party is lost, but the rest of them can still be saved. But Odysseus refuses to abandon his men and tells Eurylochus to stay behind if he wants, but that he has to go and try and save them. On his way to Circe's house, Odysseus comes across the messenger god Hermes with a golden wand, this time in the form of an adolescent boy. Hermes tells Odysseus that his men had been turned into pigs by Circe, and that he's going to suffer the same fate if he just rocks up and attempts to free them by himself. Luckily, though, Hermes has an antidote to Circe's magical potions, a plant called mole, that will allow him to resist all of her potions. He also tells Odysseus that if he wants to free his men, he has to rush at Circe with his sword out when she tries to transform him with her wand. After he pretends to attempt to murder her, she is naturally going to ask to sleep with him, which Hermes tells him that he must do, only after forcing Circe to swear an oath that she's not going to try to harm him while he's vulnerable in her bed. When Odysseus gets to Circe's house, everything unfolds exactly as Hermes said it would. And sure enough, when Odysseus counters Circe's wand with his sword, she says he must be Odysseus, as Hermes had told her that one day he would come to her island on a ship. She then asks him to sleep with her, and Odysseus does so, after making her swear not to harm him while he's in her bed. So let's just take a moment here to consider the ways in which this text treats masculine and feminine fidelity. Penelope is required to be completely faithful to Odysseus in every way, to endure decades of loneliness without a word. But for Odysseus, fidelity seems to be restricted to simply not marrying another woman. The double standard is clear. There's actually a lot more to this, and Emily Wilson has a very interesting section of her introduction devoted to this. So if you'd like to know more, let me know in the comments. I'm happy to dive into this. But back to the recap. After they've had sex, Odysseus is bathed by Circe's slaves. Then he is brought to a feast. But he won't eat, instead sitting heavy with grief as he thinks of his enchanted men. Circe notices his pain and asks him what is wrong, reminding him that she swore an oath not to harm him. He tells her that no decent man could eat or drink not knowing if his men were all right. He tells her if she wants him to eat, she has to free the men. Circe complies and goes out to let the enchanted men out of their pigsty. Then she uses her magic and potions to turn them back into men. The men are changed, returning to their same forms, but with some enhancements. They're all younger, taller, and more handsome than they were before they were transformed. They're thrilled to see Odysseus, sobbing in desperation so much that the house rings with the sound of their cries, and even Circe pities them. Circe tells Odysseus to go get the rest of his men from the shore and bring them to join her feast, and she will host them all. Odysseus goes back to the shore and is greeted by his remaining men, who are terrified but overjoyed to see him alive, and ask if he can tell them how their friends died. He tells them they're not dead and have been restored to human form, and that they've all been invited to a feast. Eurylochus is furious and tells the men not to follow Odysseus, that it will surely end in disaster. He reminds him of the Cyclops and says, "Our friends went to his home with this rash lord of ours. Because of his bad choices, they all died." Odysseus is furious and draws his sword to murder Eurylochus, but is stopped by his other men, who all agree to go with him to Circe's house, followed by Eurylochus, who is afraid of Odysseus' wrath if he doesn't. The thing is, Eurylochus is correct. Odysseus' choices do often lead to the deaths of others. Even if we discount the deaths of the Trojan War, Odysseus has led his own men into ruin and danger on this voyage home multiple times, often due more to his own poor choices and rash decisions than misadventure or fate. Consider the very beginning, when they left Troy without performing the proper sacrifices, angering Zeus and causing their initial delays. That was Odysseus' decision. Then comes all the subsequent choices, including most recently the utterly bizarre choice to antagonize the Cyclops and insist on him knowing exactly who to punish. This is another one of those moments in the text where Odysseus is depicted as a complicated man, one who isn't always rational or a good leader. I think it's important that we don't try to gloss over these moments, but rather that we consider that what the cost of Odysseus' actions can mean, and how it's usually his men that pay the ultimate price for his folly or ego. This isn't a simple tale of a hero fighting against fate, but something much more complex and open ended, something that reflects real life a bit more. Odysseus and the men from the ship return to Circe's hall and join the feasting. Circe tells Odysseus that he and his men have suffered greatly and are worn down and broken-hearted from their many trials. She says they must stay and restore their drive and energy. Odysseus agrees, and they stay for a full year. After a year, Odysseus' men come to him and say they miss their homes and they want to set out again so they can return to Ithaca. Odysseus agrees, and that night asks Circe if she'll let them leave. Circe says of course they may leave, but that they must make a detour before setting off for home. She says they must travel to the underworld to find the spirit of the dead Theban prophet Tiresias, who is the only one who can tell them how to get home safely. Odysseus weeps in grief at the thought of such a dangerous journey, but agrees. Circe gives him detailed instructions on how to sail to the land of the dead and what rituals and sacrifices to perform when he gets there to find Tiresias. Odysseus goes on to tell his men of their new heading, but while waking them up, one young man named Elpenor is startled and falls from where he was sleeping in the rafters and breaks his neck in the fall, dying instantly. They leave him there without burying him. Odysseus tells the men their new heading, and they are inconsolable, weeping and rending their clothes at the news. But they follow Odysseus to the ship, where Circe has brought the animals needed for the sacrifice that they have to do in the underworld. Heavy with grief and filled with fear, they set sail, headed not towards home, but to the land of the dead. And that's where our chapter ends. Join us next time for chapter 11 and a journey into the underworld itself. See you then.